You're listening to Science and Saucery, a show dedicated to adding life to your years. And now your hosts, registered dietitian Juliana Hever and scientist Ray Cronice.
It's a great day.
Fantastic day.
Been waiting for a while so that we could actually do our first interview.
Woohoo! We waited for this.
Yeah, it's fun. And I think it's fitting that our very first interview is with David Sinclair. He's probably the single reason why I got involved in all of this research and why I met you, and all of the things that happened because of our guest today. David and I met at TEDMed in 2009, about 10 years ago last month. And it's really neat to be able to work with somebody who is truly at the cutting edge of something so revolutionary and amazing.
Leading the way, paving the path in something so revolutionary and amazing. This book, Lifespan, that just published in September of this year is absolutely extraordinary. It's got science and history and beautiful stories and so much information that I have the audio version of it. I'm going to go get another hardcover. I can't read it enough.
Yeah, so David is an amazing scientist. He's a professor of genetics at Harvard Medical School. He's at the forefront of healthspan and longevity research. I'm so fortunate to have met him 10 years ago and to have been mentored by him. He encouraged me to write Metabolic Winter Hypothesis and also the Oxidative Priority paper, and really is open to disruptive ideas. It's refreshing to have somebody who is this much of a leader, but also this open to research. And I think he's probably one of the people that has brought the longevity and health span community together as much as it has, because, for a while, some of their work was really pushed out in 2013. Maybe we'll get into this today, but it's amazing that it came back and it showed that what they believed to be was true. But he was originally from Australia, came over and worked in Larry Guarenti's lab, another innovator in longevity and health span at MIT, and then eventually is at Harvard today. So it's really amazing for us that we have you here today for our very first interview. So welcome, David. How are you doing today?
Doing well, Ray. How are you?
Doing great. Here with Juliana.
Hello, David. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, Juliana.
So it's been really great having your book out there. I know things that I've been now talking about for a decade, thanks to your constant intervention and mentorship, now seems to be widely at least heard, if not understood. So, tell us a little bit more about your side of aging and how you got into your aging research.
I started at the very fundamental level. I was trying to understand why don't we stay young for longer. And I started studying yeast cells, the same organism that we use to make beer and bread and wine. And it turns out the yeast cells have genes that extend their lifespan called Sirtuins. And I quickly realized when I moved to Harvard in 1999 that these longevity genes were found in the human body. We have 7 of those Sirtuins. But I think even more interestingly, they were turned on by things that made the organism feel like it was uncomfortable. So if we take a yeast cell and we restrict its glucose or its amino acids or turn up the temperature, all of those things made the yeast cell live longer. And here's the important point. They all work through the same genetic pathway. So in other words, this hormesis, which is whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger, these perceived types of adversity on the yeast cell were working through the same mechanism. So fast forward, 20 years now, we now know that in our bodies, we can do the same things. We can go hungry fast. We can do certain types of exercise, hot, cold. These things also turn on the Sirtuin pathways, we believe, and they are the reason why these things we've learned are so good for us.
I think one of the interesting things about that also is that when we talk about these kinds of stress, I think one thing we lose in the analogy sometimes is that we're talking about cellular level stress. So you don't actually have to be physically uncomfortable. In other words, it doesn't require necessarily, I think that when we started talking about the metabolic winter hypothesis and the impact of mild cold stress, where you pushed me and said, hey, Ray, this applies more than just a calorie deficit, and you really should dig harder. That was 10 years ago, a month ago, that we had those conversations at TEDMed. And one of the things that I sort of fought over the time, because if you recall, people thought that was the cold stress was quite ridiculous back then, but immediately everybody goes to ice baths. And I never suggested, mild cold stress starts at, 60 F air or 80 F water temperature. And so when we're talking about these stresses and hormesis, we're not necessarily talking about misery.
Right. Exactly. Well, you can do extremes, but I've also been taught by you that just wearing a T-shirt, leaving the window cracked open a little bit, not wearing heavy bedclothes, these make a difference too. And I've been following that for many years, thanks to you.
Right. Well, thanks. And then also, I think the flip side of that in terms of food is that you don't have to quote unquote starve. You just have to adapt to eating a little less frequently and a little less. And you can, in fact, based on the diet composition, shift that food volume up or down. So you're actually eating quite a lot of a volume, but you're still not eating that much of the things that cause or the things that prevent the hormetic stress.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. If you eat the right things, you don't even have to feel hungry. And I think that's what you and Juliana have figured out, and I've kind of figured out through experimentation myself. And times when you're not hungry, sometimes we still eat, and that's craziness. You don't want to eat if you're not hungry. This world that we live in with 3 full meals a day and snacks in between, I think is killing us.
Yeah, the chronically fed state. And, we started this in metabolic winter hypothesis and even in oxidative priority. And then Juliana and I followed up on this on a paper that we wrote just on the nutrition side. One thing that people really don't recognize is that chronic overnutrition is actually the norm. Very few people, Juliana, how many people came to you in the last decade with a nutritional deficiency?
Yeah, none. In 24 years, I haven't seen one yet. Not without caloric deficiency.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
which is very rare.
So, I think that...
But that's where the intersection between healthspan and lifespan and the food triangle comes in, because as Ray told me, you said many years ago, is that fuzzy things and green things concentrate nutrients differently. So if you're talking about the left side of the triangle and eating more on the where the concentration of nutrients come from animals versus where the concentration of energy comes from plants, they have 2 completely different responses in terms of all the stuff that you're talking about. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I love how you say that after 25 years of researching aging and having read thousands of scientific papers, if there's one piece of advice I could offer on surefire way to stay healthy longer is to just simply eat less.
Yeah, and eat less often. We don't want to just be nibbling throughout the day. I think what the research says is that you do want to have periods where your body isn't extracting sugar out of your intestine. And so I've been doing monitoring of my blood sugar levels for the last couple of months. It's very interesting. It's basically a scientific study. I'm not a diabetic, but I've got a diabetic device in my arm that I wear for 2 weeks. What I've learned is that my particular metabolism, I make a lot of my own sugar in the morning. It goes up in the morning. And when I showed this to my doctor, he said, "Oh, are you having sex in the morning?" And I said, "Does it count if you're just dreaming about it?" Anyway, so what I've learned is that for me, what works is I can be quite social. Dinner is my social hour with the family or out at business. But during the day, I skip breakfast. I skip lunch as best I can. If I have lunch, it's usually a very small salad. But I don't feel hungry during the day. And it's that eating less often that I think is the key to longevity and health span.
Yeah, and actually what you're seeing when I wore a CGM for about 3 years that you and I talked about before you got this one, was when I said that it does change the way you look at food, does it not?
It's great. Even if I didn't even have the numbers and didn't try to interpret it, just the mere fact that I know that I can look inside my body after I eat,
right,
changes what I'm eating. Otherwise, most people go through their lives just using their mouth as a garbage can, shove it in and forget about it.
Exactly.
It comes out the end next day. But stuff happens when it goes into your body. And when you see it on your phone, then, you're conscious about it and what effect it'll have on you.
Well, we manage what we measure. And what you're seeing, that dawn effect, actually is related to sort of a bigger thing. I think we'll eventually get into this on our next paper. So we won't talk about that here, but I think that we can deal with that. And there's probably some things you can do to move that up and down, to move that surge that you see, because I saw this too. And there were certain things that I could do to make that go away and come back. But back to this idea that we don't need to be in the chronically fed state. And I want to really touch on our food triangle, because when you and Andrew Bremer, who's at NIH currently, and I were talking about this, our goal was to segregate food in a way that we didn't rely simply on protein, carbs, and fat to delineate between food, because these descriptors, while biologically they do describe the molecular bonds and the structure, the overall structure of very important biomolecules, they aren't isometabolic. They aren't metabolically similar. Eating an apple and drinking apple juice, even if it's the same amount of calories, has a very different metabolic impact. And why I think this is particularly important right now is that you see these wars where everybody thinks fat. And of course, in the studies you guys have done, it depends on what fat and how much fat. And then they say protein. And you also know that, or have seen the fact of individual amino acids, particularly methionine, the branched chain amino acids. And then the same thing is actually true on dietary carbohydrates. Is it a resistant starch and cellulose, or is it glucose? Is it fructose? Is it lactose, galactose? I mean, all of these have these metabolic impacts. And so while it may have been a great calorie equalizer, the idea that we segregate foods by calling them protein, carbs, and fat can be a misnomer. And so can you apply that a little bit to chronic overnutrition, and also maybe where the research could go, even in model organisms, where we're better controlling the distribution of, say, simple versus complex carbohydrates, or certain amino acids, or certain lipids? I mean, we're not always controlling for all those, are we?
Well, we're not, and the problem for most people is it takes a lot of effort to think about this all the time. But it certainly was oversimplified with the food pyramid, and I think where you're headed with your research is a good direction to say that all carbs, all protein are definitely not the same. And there's also this issue with, there's a lot of people saying just eat all meat. There's the carnivore diet, and then there's never eat meat. And it's almost as though there's this food war, food fight going on. But one of the big differences between a plant-based diet and a meat diet is that you actually, the volume of food that you can eat dramatically changes, right? So I can snack on a vegetable all night, and it's going to be nutritious. I'm not going to feel hungry. Whereas if I eat a small amount of meat, which is equivalent calories or fat, I will get hungry. And really, part of my life, I think most of us, is trying to avoid being hungry because it's not pleasant, but get the nutrition that we need to function and to grow and build muscle and be strong. And that's the dichotomy here. I mean, there's no doubt that eating a lot of meat is going to help build muscle. It's going to activate Mtor.
Mm-hmm.
and a whole bunch of other things. But the trade-off with doing that is that your Mtor is going to now tell the cells not to fight against disease and aging. And while you look good, you're not going to get the longevity benefit, I don't think. And so I think your food pyramids, the new food pyramid makes a lot more sense.
We're into triangles, not pyramids.
Sorry, that changed my.
Yeah, you got to change your vernacular. We don't do pyramids.
Okay.
We only do triangles.
But that's a good segue into talking about the three main longevity pathways, the Mtor, the Ampk, and the Sirtuins. Can you talk a little bit about that and the intersection with what you were just talking about?
Yeah, there are three main longevity pathways that researchers like myself have figured out, mainly through studying simple organisms like yeast and worms and flies and mice. But now the reason that this is now going mainstream is that we've realized that these same processes occur in our bodies as well. The three main ones are called Mtor, which we just talked about. Mtor is shut off by low amounts of amino acids. And so if you eat a steak, Mtor will turn on and build the body. There's another one called Ampk, or AMP kinase. That's an enzyme that responds to how much chemical energy our body has. So if you eat a lot of sugar, it will sense that. You actually want a lot of AMP kinase activation because that is the body saying, I don't have enough energy, and it'll start to burn fat, build mitochondria, and do all that good stuff. And then the third group is Sirtuins. We work on these Sirtuins from yeast cells, and we've got 7 of those in the body, as I mentioned. And Sirtuins are interesting because they need NAD for their activity, and NAD levels go down as we get older. And the thought is that if we can maintain those levels, then our Sirtuin defenses will remain optimized. And there are a lot of things you can do to maximize the use of these pathways, but each one involves something slightly different. And that's where science is right now, trying to figure out how to modify diet, exercise, and other things, including cold, to make sure those three pathways are optimal. But it's complicated, of course, because they're talking to each other, and if you tweak one, it'll actually affect the others.
Which is really interesting when you talk about metformin, and you've publicly talked about how you are taking metformin without having a diabetes diagnosis, something that I'm really inspired to try myself after reading all of your work. But I'm first interested in how that has impacted your blood sugar since you're watching it, but also in terms of there's that dichotomy right there with exercise recovery with metformin versus the impact on blood sugar control. So I'm curious about that, if you could share.
Sure. So metformin, if you don't know, is the frontline therapy for high blood sugar or type 2 diabetes. And an increasing number of us scientists have looked at the scientific literature and studies that have looked at over 10,000 people taking metformin and seen that those patients have lower rates of cancer and heart disease, of course diabetes, and even frailty and Alzheimer's. So this looks a lot like a longevity drug, but it's been around since the 1970s. And the thought is that by activating AMPK, we can give ourselves the best shot of not getting these diseases till much later, of course. But one of the things that's interesting about AMPK is that it also controls your body's ability to build muscle. It's talking to this Mtor pathway. And so there have been a couple of studies recently that have shown that metformin slightly inhibits muscle size during exercise. But I think those studies were overblown in terms of the headlines. If you look and very deeply at the data like I have and talk to the scientists that did the study, there are much more similarities between the muscles of the metformin and non-metformin groups than there were differences. So they always want to emphasize differences, of course. That's how scientists work. So all the groups, all the people that took metformin or didn't gain muscle, but there were some differences. Those on metformin had slightly smaller muscles, but they were just as strong as the other group. And they had lower inflammation and free radical damage. So here's the bottom line, I think, from having read all of this. If you want to be a bodybuilder or you're an athlete for a living, then by all means don't use metformin or don't take metformin on the days you've exercised and you're recovering. But for someone like me, where I'm 50 and the only person I need to impress is my wife, then I'm not so worried about that. I'm more worried about being spoon-fed in my 80s by my children.
Yeah, exactly.
So that, for me, I'm going to take metformin. I'm not taking it currently only on days when I have an intense workout. That's on a Sunday every week. But other days I'm going to take it because the best correlate of longevity that we have right now in your blood is glucose levels, fasting blood glucose, and it will inch up every year. And only exercise and these supplements will keep it in control.
Yeah, and I want to compare that and contrast that because a lot of people that also follow us talk about weight loss because of what we do on in our day job. And one other place where I see this same overblown reaction is weight loss without exercise. And it would be interesting to look at how this overlaps. But, I remember specifically one of the more recent ones in American Journal of Clinical Nutrition was they had, just 5 or 10, maybe 10 or 12 pounds over 12 weeks. Our clients lose about 0.6 to 0.8 pounds a day. So that would be 50 to 70 pounds. And when you look at the differences are small differences like in single-digit percentages of fat-free mass. And, of course, fat-free mass isn't necessarily lean mass. Thinking of the muscle cell as a monolithic substance is not really the proper model. Those little cells in their cytoplasm and all of the free amino acids that are in there and all the other cellular, we'll just call it goop for right now, that goes on in protein synthesis, et cetera, those things can actually... they can dump some of that cellular content and absorb it without actually losing the tissue. And so one of the things that when we see these slight differences, I always question, are we really seeing an effect? And why I say this is because in the case of weight loss and fat-free mass or weight loss and lean tissue, if you're only losing weight at a very low level, and let's just translate this directly over to calorie, if you're only dietary restricting at a very high level, you may not be in the regime where you actually see some of the benefits. And I think it's fair to say that had metformin come along after all of the longevity work instead of before, it may or may not have been listed as a drug. I mean, it's a biomolecule that's out there, that's been out there for a while, and it may have been as common as resveratrol is today. I mean, isn't that the case?
So it's derived from French lilac. It's a guanide. In this case, it's biguanide. Yeah, two of them. It's been chemically modified. I think it's got a methyl or two on there to stabilize it. But essentially, it's a plant-derived molecule. So something like it would have hit the market. Berberine is out there already. That's what's called, quote-unquote, the poor man's metformin. But yeah, it is silly that metformin is still regarded as a drug. That's probably, I'm going to get in trouble for saying that, but there are plenty of countries in the world where metformin is, you just go and get it over the counter without a prescription.
Right.
And the World Health Organization has called it an essential medicine for humanity. This should be widely available in my view. Now, you'd want to have some consultation with a doctor, I think, just in case it's going to interfere with medicines you're already taking. And there's extremely rare cases of people getting very sick from this called lactic acidosis. Mm-hmm. But generally, the worst you have is a stomach upset and you don't feel hungry, which certainly isn't life-threatening, and people know what to do if they feel sick. They just stop taking the medicine or take less of it. But yeah, I haven't seen any push for metformin to be made over the counter, unfortunately.
Right.
I have heard, though, that the sales of metformin have gone up 30% over the last few years, and that's not due to diabetes. That's because people are asking their doctors to prescribe it off-label because the science of longevity is so compelling for that molecule.
Right.
Wow.
And I think this is such an important point because we are at that intersection of pharmacology and healthspan and lifespan where we're not treating diseases. And, getting back to what we were talking about in the beginning, or we asked about curing aging, I think you might want to clarify with some people, one of the big problems is even in your early work, you got sidetracked or corralled into treating a disease, a specific disease. And can you explain a little bit of how treating that specific disease is very different from attacking aging, especially as it applies to sort of drug development, et cetera?
Well, so aging isn't considered a disease, and that means that doctors cannot prescribe a medicine for aging, even though we believe there are drugs that are likely to help. And that's really unfortunate. And part of the problem is just historical, that people are taught that aging is something different than a disease. But it's actually the root cause of pretty much all the diseases that affect adults in late life. And if you look at the definition of disease, it's something that reduces the body's function over time that happens to less than 50%. And if it happens to more than 50%, we just call that aging. And if something that's happening to 49.9% of people that's bad, we will spend billions of dollars to try and fix 49% of the population. My goodness, let's cure that. But if it happens to 51, it's like, oh, okay, that's natural, no problem. And that's ridiculous. That's a crazy way of doing it.
And it is really that you're not exaggerating. This is it. I mean, if you go to the FDA now and say, I have a drug for aging, how do you apply?
Well, they'll laugh you out of the room because they think aging is something you can't do anything about and it's natural and it doesn't have anything to do with medicine, when actually it's the major cause of all these diseases. And so instead we have a system where we're playing whack-a-mole medicine, and doctors are, you come into the doctor, you're sick, you get a medicine, the patient comes back with another disease, get another medicine, and the doctors just repeat that until failure. Instead, what we should be doing is treating the actual causes of these diseases, which is aging itself. And with a single treatment, or maybe just a few treatments, we could push most of the diseases that affect us off into the future. And I think in 50 years, people will look back at today, these kind of conversations, and they'll think, that's really weird that they didn't even understand that. As though we go back 100 years and people are wondering, why would you want to drink a juice from a penicillium to cure infections?
Right. I think that's a good segue to, let's go to the sort of the other end of the spectrum, the work that you're working on right now for Nature with epigenetic reversal, the OSK work. Can you explain a little bit more about what we understand about aging and why that work that you're doing right now is so critical and important?
We have been looking for many years at trying to understand why we age, because I don't think if you don't understand why we age, then we're not going to be able to do much about it. And about 10 years ago, my colleagues and I came up with what we all agreed were the 8 or 9 hallmarks of aging. And those are things that go wrong in the body: senescent cell buildup, stem cell loss, deregulation of nutrient sensing, DNA damage. The list goes on, telomere shortening. But what has always bothered me is that that's not explaining why we age. That's just listing things that go wrong. And since I started working on this 30 years ago, I've been looking for a single unifying theory that would explain why all life on the planet ages. And it's crazy that we don't understand why does everything grow old. The trees grow old, the bacteria grow old, the yeast cells grow old, we grow old. And no one ever said, well, here's why it happens. And just saying, oh, things fall apart is not a good explanation. So I've come up with a theory called the information theory of aging, which helps explain why all of those hallmarks of aging occur, and also what drives the process. And when I talk about loss of information causing aging, I don't mean losing the genetic information in our bodies. That's actually largely intact, surprisingly, as we get older. But it's the control systems of the genome, the so-called epigenome. And that information is just as important for health. And I think the loss of that information is what causes us to age and get sick.
Can you explain that theory a little bit more? It's so fascinating.
Yeah. So at a high level, it's like we have a piano, and there's, instead of 80 keys, there's 20,000. And our cells have to play the right tune to be a liver cell or a nerve cell. And initially that works very well when we're babies, but even in our teenage years, we're aging and there's a few notes that are played badly. But by the time we're 70, it's such a mess. The pianist's hitting all sorts of wrong notes, and the music is so bad you want to walk out of the room or turn off the DVD player or the. I use DVD not because I'm being an old fuddy-duddy, but the DVD is a really nice analogy for what I'm talking about. The DVD, it has digital information, which is the genome, and that is really beautifully stored in digital format. But the analog reader, which is the laser and the plastic above it, that is analog. And if the DVD gets scratched, then we lose the ability to read the information.
Yeah.
And what we're saying is that information, which is encoded in our genes, is still there when we're old. We just need to restore the cell's ability to read the genes at the right time. And at the cellular level, for the biologists, what we're saying is that the ability to read the genome involves looping out parts of the chromosome so that they're accessible to enzymes. And those genes that shouldn't be on, like a nerve cell gene in a liver cell, you don't want that on. You bundle that up and tightly wrap it around histone proteins. And so that you've got this looping and bundling structure that's different in every cell type. And those loops and bundles get disrupted by things happening during our life, such as a broken chromosome will disrupt that structure. And we find that in mice, if we disrupt that structure by cutting the chromosome, we end up with mice that get 50% older. Not just looking older, but when we measure their biological age, which we can do now, they are literally 50% older.
And so tell us a little bit about the latest work with the OSK with actually the reversal of that epigenetic damage.
The loops and the bundles that control the cell type, there's a particular mechanism the cell uses to mark those regions, and those are called DNA methylation. Essentially, it's just a small chemical that gets stuck to your DNA. Think of it like plaque on your teeth that accumulates over time. And the rate that changes over time is a very good predictor of your biological age. In fact, if I took your blood samples now, I could tell you how old each of you is within a few percent error, and when you're going to die unless you change your trajectory. And that perfectly fits with the information theory of aging. Now, once we thought we figured out why aging is occurring, we needed to reset those structures. Can you get back those beautiful young loops of DNA and bundles? We didn't know if that was possible, but we tried. And for that to be possible, there basically has to be a backup hard drive of youthfulness somewhere in the cell that can restore those loops the way they are when we're young. And we borrowed a set of tools from a guy called Yamanaka. Shinya Yamanaka won the Nobel Prize in 2012 for discovering a set of 4 genes that make cells extremely young, so young that they become stem cells. And in that way, we can take skin cells and make them into any cell type we want. But we didn't want to do that. We don't want to take aging back to 0. We want to take it back about, 50% would be a good mark. So we didn't use all of his 4 genes. We used 3 of them and put those into cells and rewound the clock. And those loops and bundles went back to a youthful pattern. And then we stuck the genes using a gene therapy delivered into the eye. We could reprogram the retina. And we sent the age of an old retina back, I think about 70% of what it was before.
That's amazing.
That's incredible.
Much younger. And then those old mice that we treated for 4 weeks, they got their vision back perfectly, like they were young again.
Which is amazing. And this is those 3 genes that are denoted by the OSK and what we were talking about earlier. Those are the 3 of his genes that you used. Exactly.
So OCT4, SOX2, and KLF4 are the 3 that work for us, and we find we need those 3 genes. The one that we left off causes cancer, so didn't take a genius to leave that one out.
There you go.
But it was lucky that it worked without it.
And looking at this maybe back at 30,000 feet to sort of wrap it back into even our work together, what we've talked about with the metabolic winter hypothesis and, adding to that xenohormesis, and maybe we'll define that a little bit after this, but that the idea that what's happening at a cellular level is that some of this repacking, some of this remodeling in the mitochondrial or at the cellular level is happening as a response to these stresses. And that what we're talking about in sort of the bigger sense is that in different stages of your life, your body is prioritizing different things, so that those things that are being prioritized, say 0 to puberty, might be different than those things that are prioritized in the 15 to 20 years of reproductive prime. And then post-reproductive prime, we have a whole set of other things where there isn't even a feedback loop because you've already passed your genes on to your offspring. And so this idea of looking to the past for some ancestral diet or looking at some ideal, we don't have to look that way. We actually can pick and choose, just like you're talking about with these genes, pick and choose our diet or our environment or our feeding frequency in a way that maximizes all of this together. Is that a accurate way to put it?
Yeah, that's a fair statement. And the thing that ties all of that together are these sirtuin enzymes that we've been studying. Sirtuins are what are called silencing proteins, and they form these bundles in the cell, and they control how the cells read the genes. And if we're not activating the sirtuins and making them very efficient, we will lose those structures faster, and we will age faster, I believe.
So bringing it back to a practical level, and I know you always say, and aptly so, that you don't give advice, but how do we, in a practical sense, apply all of these things that you've put together in terms of our best bet at activating these sirtuins?
Well, the studies that we and others have done in mice and in people indicate that high-intensity exercise will do it. We can see increased blood flow, new capillaries in the muscle, more mitochondria, all that good stuff when we turn on the sirtuins and raise NAD levels in mice. And we're testing this in people now. Hopefully next year we'll have some results. And then besides exercise, being hungry, having low insulin levels, not always being fed in a fed state is another way. Mtor also controls sirtuins, so having periods where you're not full of branched-chain amino acids would be good.
Methionine.
And methionine for sure. So there's all that, and then you can go ahead, Ray.
No, I was just going to say you just did a little thing on Twitter where it's just amazing that when we look at, for example, comparing methionine levels in halibut versus kidney beans. It's 20, like it was like 29 milligrams per gram versus 13 or something milligrams per gram. And the idea that when we look at even in the mice studies that you're doing, we're not always controlling those quote unquote protein sources, back to the food triangle, in these feeds aren't always controlling for every single individual amino acid unless the study is specifically looking at that. So they're eating on the left or the right side of the food triangle is going to be a way, and this is why we did it, a decade ago or 2014. This was one of the things you and Andrew and I talked about, which was that you're naturally segregating these things, like branched-chain amino acids, because he was looking at branched-chain amino acids from a diabetes perspective, and we were looking at it more from the other perspective. So the idea that this nutrition is concentrated differently on the left and right side of the food triangle, and this is a specific example of one that we found benefit. Right.
And so low amounts of methionine will work well in animals to extend their lifespan. Again, by triggering these same pathways of resistance to disease. The other way to boost sirtuins, particularly number 3, is to be a bit cold. And so if you're a bit chilly, or in my case, I jump into a cold bath every weekend, I'm going to stimulate sirtuin number 3 and boost my brown fat and hopefully raise my mitochondrial activity and overall metabolic rate, which means that I'm going to be burning more energy, not putting on as much weight. And we also think that this brown fat secretes things that are good for us. So we haven't exactly found what they are yet. There's a lot of scientists working on that. So there's a lot you can do to raise your sirtuin activity. I also take a supplement called NMN, which is nicotinamide mononucleotide. It's the immediate precursor for cells to make NAD. they don't need to bring in anything else to make NAD. There are some other supplements like nicotinamide riboside that some people are taking and buying off the internet, where that doesn't have a phosphate, so they have to get their phosphate from somewhere else. In any case, NMN, we know from clinical trials, does raise NAD levels in the blood, at least. And we'll know, as I said, next year if they actually do anything. But until I know more, I'm taking NMN because it's seemingly a very safe molecule. And I think having high NAD levels, like I did when I was young, when I was 20, is probably a good thing.
Yes. Well, let's see. Is there any other areas that you see us going in the next 5 years that look really promising? Is there anything out there that is maybe a recent surprise? Because I know that you've talked about a lot of these things on other interviews and with your book. What's something interesting for the next 5 years? Do you think?
All right. Well, I'll tell you something I haven't told anybody. You're an old friend, Ray. The gene therapy is great. We're working towards doing human studies, clinical trials on patients with glaucoma, damage to the eye from pressure. That's all great, but it's expensive. And my goal is to make these treatments inexpensive, so we don't just have a rich versus poor situation. And so we're working hard on trying to find natural ways to reprogram cells instead of using the genes. And we're having some recent breakthroughs in that regard. So I think eventually it will be possible to give the body some natural molecules and actually make their aging clock go backwards.
Now that's fantastic. I can't believe we're alive during this time. From when you talked about the DVD and we joked about that, and I immediately was thinking of the analog problem of video and audio production, where you had artifact concatenation even in the digital side, where you're making copies of copies of copies and they're not replicating. But right now, the fact that we've just taken that same debate and we know how clear video is today, we know how clear audio is today, we know how easy it is to duplicate and to spread that information. And really what we're talking about right now is that in another 15 or 20 years, if we just fast forward from the time when you started this work in the 90s, and we were right there with digital and versus analog audio and video, really we're talking about the same thing at the cellular level. And it seems very practical, even though we're not sure exactly how all that's going to happen. It doesn't seem impossible anymore. When we were stuck in the idea of the sort of genetic, the accumulation of breaks that were just random scrambling of DNA, when that was the way we believed aging happened, it was sort of hopeless. But I think we've moved it into a place where it's an exciting time to be doing this. And quite frankly, I've got you by 5 years. So I'm older by 5 years, so you really need to get on this. I don't want to be the last person to die of a age-related disease.
Yeah,
right.
It is sad that we were born this early. I would love to be born today, because the things that they're going to see are going to be just mind-bending.
And a lot of people really have a hard time when you first start thinking about this. As you say, this idea of aging and death seems completely set in stone or set in concrete. And when we think of like a hydra, there's no limit. I mean, a hydra is virtually immortal. And so I've repeated what you've said, which is there's no biological imperative that we have to age and that we have to. There's nothing in biology that says, no, this is completely impossible.
Couldn't agree more. That was well put, actually, the way we've moved into the digital era. We're going to do the same with biology. And what has been important for the internet to thrive, thanks to Claude Shannon's work at MIT, where he came up with the whole theory of digital information and preservation of code. That was in 1948. Now today, we basically assume every email we send is going to get there. What made that possible was that he said we need a backup copy of the information, so if it gets lost along the way, we can go retrieve it. We've just discovered that cells have that backup copy. We didn't know that 2 years ago. It's, like you say, an incredibly exciting time.
It is. And 25 years ago, another very close friend of mine, Tim Jennison, who founded a company called NewTek, if you haven't seen Tim's Vermeer is about how he sort of reverse engineered how Johannes Vermeer might have done his drawings. But Tim was dealing with the same thing because hard drives weren't fast enough. And he came up with his own way of encoding video because, again, it had so much data in it. And at that time, Tim was dealing with really the exact same problem you're dealing with today. And today, no one even thinks, like, no one recognizes that their phone is so much better quality than what we were dealing with VHS and SVHS and Beta, Cam, and all the video formats. And then you go to audio tapes, the 1-inch, 2-inch, whatever. And even when we go to the digital D1, D2, the other component versus composite formats, and people that are old enough to remember that realize at that time we would have thought it was virtually impossible to carry around in our pocket a phone, which isn't really even a camera, to completely displace it. It was never going to approach film. That's what everybody said. And yet here we are. And I lived through that and I watched it happen. And once you brought up this idea of this digital information analogy, to me, I immediately saw this and said, I just lived through this. I just watched it happen. And I couldn't see any different from a biological sense that we can't do the same thing. It just happened.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's exciting.
Yeah, it's super exciting. We don't know exactly how the clock works. We've pulled it apart a little bit, and we've seen some of the cogs, but we do know it's possible.
Right.
And the good news is that we don't have to build the internet. Our body has already got that going. We just need to turn it on. And that's what the OSK treatment has shown it's possible to do.
Yeah, well, one thing we've learned from disruptive technologies and innovation, and I learned this from another mentor, Burt Rutan, who's a leader in aeronautical aviation, which is most innovations are thought to be impossible right before they happen. But he always used to go around and give another analogy about Wilbur Wright and the airplane. You know, it wasn't when their first flight when really aviation took off. It was when Wilbur went to Paris. Because as soon as people believed they could fly, everybody started making planes. And then suddenly, because that leap of saying, I can fly or I can't fly was the disruptive technology. And I feel like in the last decade, what I've watched, especially when I was there in 2013 or so, when resveratrol and those whole Sirtuin mechanisms were being challenged. You and I were friends then, and that was a tough time in your life. But once we've gotten beyond that, it seems like once people know they can do it, now you get everybody looking for it. Does that make sense?
Well, right. I think every paradigm shift in science attracts people who want to criticize it and say it cannot be possible. And that's what I lived through in my 40s. It was a tough time.
Yeah.
But the science has borne out. We've been proven correct. And I'm only slightly bitter about the whole thing. The whole field was destroyed for a decade. I mean, how can that happen?
I watched it real time. We had conversations back then about that. But the good news is here we are, and I want to move forward because one of the things we see and what we're trying to do in our book, Healthspan Solution, which I think when it comes out, it will be very compatible with Lifespan, your book, and we'll talk about that too. It's actually a very technical, but it's very approachable for the average person because of these kinds of stories that you use and the really amazing way that you treat the characters of aging. I think was just a brilliant way to organize and write it. But I think one of the things we see is that, unfortunately, diet, the war you were talking about, the eat meat, don't eat meat, the vegan versus carnivore diet, which is just not an interesting debate for me to be involved in. And one of the issues that I see happening in data over the next decade is that now the food industry has discovered this desire for being more on the plant side. And what I think we're going to see increasingly is they're now making junk food. I mean, what is it you always say, Juliana, about that?
Anything you could eat, I could eat vegan. Because
right.
now you have every vegan ice cream and vegan burgers.
So 10 years from now, we may not have a delineation of those. And that's why I think the specific linking of what we've done with the food triangle and looking at whole foods, not adulterating the left and the right arm of the experiment. In other words, we adulterate one side with refined sugars, we adulterate the other side with refined fats, or we adulterate both sides with quote-unquote protein sources, and we're not looking at the granularity that we need to see these responses that happen naturally when you eat whole foods on either side. And I think this becomes a place where I don't want to lose that, just like, recently having a little debate about it's only caloric restriction, protein has nothing to do with it. I can't imagine anyone saying that at this point because we know the role of amino acids in these other mechanisms, but it's always being said, and it's normally being said, I think, because people want it to come out a certain way. But this idea of bringing it all together and being able to look at, something that is manageable so that you don't have to start your lectures by saying, I try calorie restriction, but, I think I'm not sure if I was going to live longer or die later or felt like I was dying or however you say it. My point is, I think it can be pleasant. And I think the kinds of recipes we put together allow people to do that. And it can't be distilled down to protein, carbs, and fat. It just isn't enough granularity. And I hope that the lab experiments start moving into that territory more, even though I still do believe the major longevity and health span increases will be made not necessarily with diet alone, but with pharmacological intervention.
Yeah, well said. Well, I look forward to your book because we're always struggling to know what to eat and what to give our kids. And I don't think anyone's done a great job of looking at all the science that's out there and distilling it down for some practical ways to eat. I've seen a preprint of your book. It's fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So yeah, when's the date it's coming out?
December 17th.
Wow, great.
So
look
soon.
Forward to that.
Okay.
David, your book is full of absolute beautiful stories and inspiration and history and science. I absolutely love your book. I can't recommend it highly enough, Lifespan. And I just want to ask you more of a philosophical question kind of to end on. You have this amazing joie de vivre that you emulate, that you've gone to all these audiences and you've asked people, do you want to live to be 100, 120? And most people, a lot of people, you could answer this better. Obviously, I've just heard you in a bunch of interviews talking about how many people don't want to age long because we don't want to deal with all of these, being sick. And you demonstrate this so beautifully in your book. But you talk about this one story that really resonated with me when you're on the plane with your wife. And because, Ray will tell you I'm like a crazy nervous flyer. And you talk about how she'll jump at turbulence, but that you just have this sense of peace that you've got this beautiful, I don't know, this, I like to say like this joie de vivre that you emulate because is that because of your research, or what can you share a little bit about that in your perspective?
Oh, well, so I've made it to 50 and I'm actually quite surprised. I'm at this age, so everything else is a bonus. But I also have overcome pretty much all my fears in life. I used to be scared of even small heights. 10 feet, I'd be scared to jump off. That's fine now. So somehow I've managed to gain control of my mind. I'm old enough now to know what I wasn't good at and what I was good at, and then just through the power of being conscious and trying to overcome my stupid fears, I've been able to do that, and that includes flying. It also helps that I've had a lot more practice at it over the years, but I've also been in some scary situations with my wife, sometimes without, where it was pretty hairy. A couple of occasions where the plane had to land in an emergency. But I don't get scared. Why is that? Well, I think that the best thing I ever did in my life was letting go of the fear of dying. Now, what I can tell you, at least from my experience, is you don't need to be scared of death to live your life well and love every day. And I think that's a big mistake when people say, oh, if we're going to live for 150, 200 years, life won't have the same meaning. That is a bunch of BS.
I agree.
People love their life. They love their kids. They love their parents. They love the experience of life. And if you maintain a sense of wonder and curiosity about the world, you just want to stick around. And that's how I look at life, even though I'm not afraid of the end of it.
That's beautiful.
That
Thank you.
is just an amazing way to end it. So, well, thank you for spending time with us today. We've got to do it again. We may have you back. You may be one of our frequent guests, and hopefully at some point we have some new work that we can get out there and talk about that too. But thank you for everything you've done. I certainly personally owe a great deal of gratitude since this is Thanksgiving week. I owe, when we're recording this, I owe a great deal of gratitude to have met you and for you to put your knowledge and everything behind the work that we were doing. I'm very, very grateful.
Well, thanks. Thanks for all the work that you two are doing as well. It's been great to be on. Thanks for having me.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Well, that was amazing.
Absolutely fascinating. What an extraordinary leader.
Just incredible.
Thank you so much for joining us on this leafy green path to good health.
It's always the food. So remember,
Keep eating right.
Thank you for listening to Science and Saucery. For more details about the content in today's show or to contact Juliana and Ray, please visit us at healthspansolution.com.